So I'm going to begin with this little agenda about condensing colonies, and I want you to take away from this brief slide here that thermoregulation occurs on a continuum through both the heating season and through when the environment is under a lot of stress from hot temperatures, which is a problem in your climate, I'm sure. It is in ours too, in some of our southern regions, but pretty much we focus on the heating side, but there's also some stuff I want to share you too about heat shielding bees that I think you'll be really interested in. So we're going to go over the physical hive body, and we'll talk a little bit about the thermal flows that occur inside of a condensing colony. So again, everything I talk about in this part of my talk is going to be about condensing colonies and how these things work in condensing colonies. And then I want to especially emphasize how the bees' biological need is to control all the hive gases inside their colony. And to the extent that we allow them to do that and put them in boxes that they can use for the purposes of providing thermoregulation and for stabilizing the hive environment, that's when they're living closer to their biological origin. So we have, we'll mention a little bit about the dew point physics. So let's give you a little pyramid, and I'm going to stop from the top of this pyramid and work down. And we all know that the Western honeybee or cavity nester and has global dominance and has been successful as an extraordinary pollinator in all latitudes, or many latitudes. And that's the primary reason for that is that they have this extraordinary evolutionary adaptation of thermoregulation. So you really can't talk about condensing colonies unless you include the fact that it is a stable hive environment for thermal regulation. And if you understand that concept, then you get it, why the box and the environment and thermoregulation go together. All right, so in a condensing colony, you end up with the box itself is rather simple, and you can see plenty of examples on the floor in your vendor area, I think. You've got Hive IQ there, and maybe Primal Bee and some other folks that are making poly boxes that are will naturally configure a colony into a condensing configuration if you allow them. And so it's a tight enclosure, no added ventilation, and it has to have adequate insulation. So those things are the physical characteristics that you need in the box. Bees have evolved to select cavities that provide those things naturally. And when we keep them in our boxes, we sometimes don't pay a lot of attention to that part, but to let you know that the bees are paying attention to it. Now, when you put bees in an enclosure that allows for a condensing colony to exist, they will convect that colony, the thermal flows, the way that the heat moves, moisture and gases move in that colony is under complete control of the bees. So in a condensing colony, the bees survive, and they manage, in minute intervals, they manage the way that they work the hive gases, but it's totally in concert with their needs. All right, so here's just the IR image of what a colony looks like. So you get, this is a real world image, of course, of how that heat dome is required or develops over the top of a cluster. Now, I just want to emphasize this again, that a condensing colony will conserve CO2, and I'll explain why they do that, heat and moisture. And again, it's in concert with the cluster's needs. And I consider that to be a biologically stable environment, because that's the way the bees have evolved to live, and that's what they can survive most comfortably in, when they can actually establish homeostasis and then control all the hive gases. As you move away from that biologically stable convectant-driven colony to one that has a whole lot of ventilation, and there are places for other gases to escape from that box, your colony now moves into another principle of convection, which is called the stack, that moves air around, which is called the stack effect. Engineers use this all the time in building envelopes, and this is in total opposition of what the cluster needs. There's absolutely no consideration when your colony's in exiting gases and moisture out in terms of stack effect. It just happens because there's a difference in the temperature of the entrance and the upper part of the box, right? So it's and if you provide an abundant amount of accidental ventilation in your beekeeping practice, you can move from a biologically stable condition all the way over to survival mode. Here in the Northeast, you couldn't, in Northeast the U.S., you couldn't put bees in a cardboard box and expect them to survive the winter. All right, so we know that I'm on the heating side of this condensing colony now. We'll get into a little bit of heat shielding later on. So we know bees use their indirect flight muscles to generate heat, and they can generate a whole lot of it. It's expensive biologically for them to do that, and they're using carbohydrate as a fuel to do it, which gives off moisture and heat. And they use their thorax muscles, which they put into a isometric state. And in that state, there's no movement at all. It's just that their musculature is using energy, and it develops heat. All right, so I'm play this little video for you, where you can just see a heater bee coming out of a cell. Here's first regular photography, then IR, and you can see the thorax of that bee. Now, it'll be important when we discuss. Notice that. Let me back up a little bit. Notice that the abdomen of the bee above the bee on the right-hand side is cool. So when we get over to the heat side of this equation, when we talk about heat shielding, the part of the bees use their abdomen, which is cooler, to absorb heat, right? So they're using both parts of their body for thermal regulation. Their abdomen for heat shielding and their thorax for heating. All right, when you do develop, and this is from this is something that a friend of mine, Randy Oliver, out in the West Coast of the United States, allowed me to use. And if you look at the core here, in this little complicated diagram, you see that it depicts what's occurring in that core while heater bees are generating heat. So the temperature goes up, of course. That's the reason why they're thermoregulating. And then also the CO2 goes up, and because I mentioned they were using carbohydrate, which they then metabolize at the cellular level, and they give off CO2 as just like we do. And then so that once they replace some of the natural nitrogen and oxygen molecules in that core, they replace them with moisture or vapor, and vapor mixed in with that atmospheric condition gives air its buoyancy. It moves up through the core, out of the insulating shell that happens on the outside of that. Say this is a cluster when bees are cold, and it exits out. Now, if they're in a condensing colony where there's plenty of insulation above, that part of above the colony will, above the cluster will stay above the dew point, and no liquid moisture will form. I'll show you a photograph of that in a minute. And then two other really important things occur when a colony is allowed to condense its gases on its own. Those gases that exit out that mantle give off latent heat as they begin to turn into liquid moisture. So the latent heat recovery in the wintertime, especially when it's cold, is really important to bees. It also occurs, by the way, in other times when it doesn't seem like bees should be clustering up, but there is a certain amount of latent heat that is given off. In the wintertime, when your bees are trying to make energy, latent heat can contribute to about 13% of their energy needs for the entire season. And then it'll turn into liquid moisture or water droplets, which is available for them to use for whatever reason they want, to stabilize their internal moisture needs, or to drink or to use and mix it with honey and feed brood. So there's a picture of taking off of an inner cover or a telescoping cover, heavily insulated telescoping cover on a condensing colony. You can see the pattern of condensation that occurs over that cluster due to the all right, so why is it that bees actually conserve CO2? And they do a great job of that. So when bees are clustering, or even at other times, they are driving the oxygen out of their inner core and also for most of the cluster. And the cluster is gaining in its percentage of CO2 and goes high as 14%. Some of the early studies that Tom Seeley did up in our Cornell University up in upstate New York indicated that bees will start fanning in increasingly large numbers as their CO2 level gets above a certain percentage. Just to let you know, bees can live in 100% CO2 for an extended period and not suffer any consequences from it. So they're hypoxia tolerant. They're not like us. If we were in a 5% CO2 environment, we might start to feel the symptoms. At 10%, we'd be dead. So bees are using that to drive the oxygen out of the Krebs cycle that they're using in their mitochondria in their cellular structure to generate heat. If they deprive that process of oxygen, their metabolic rate lowers. And a low metabolic rate will allow bees to conserve moisture, and they do a better. It's a lower percentage of bees that are engaged in thermoregulation, and it also keeps them in a semi-alert state. So if they need to defend their stores, they're available for that. We put them in that state in some storage facilities in the United States. Okay, so this is just a summary, and then we're going to move on to heat shielding a little bit. But of course, I didn't mention this, but of course, it requires less honey for a condensing colony that's making heat in colder temperatures. Requires less honey for metabolic use, obviously because of the adequate insulation. And then I mentioned they're hypoxia tolerant. I went over the dew point physics with you. And I just want to emphasize that again, this idea that bees need a container where they can manage homeostasis is extremely important. It's the single most critical biological need that they have. They want to control the hive gases. We sometimes invite ourselves to that party, but I'm not certain we ever really got an invitation. All right, so here's the beginning of the end of this talk where I'm going to get a little bit of, squeeze a little heat shielding. And of course, this is bearding, and I'm sure you see a lot of this. This is extreme bearding. I'll show you an example later on of a little bit less extreme bearding. But I'm assuming that I know heat shielding bees are fact, and I'll show you some studies, a study that proves that. But I think that there's some relation between bearding and the individual efforts of bees that live inside the colony and are doing this another biological behavior, using their abdomen to shield different parts from heat. And I think there's some kind of an exchange between this bearded mass and those bees. And I'm going to try to get more data on that. You heard a friend of mine speak earlier, and Cameron Jack from the University of Florida. I'm going to try to get down there with him this summer and use an IR camera to see if there are really heat shielding bees running around from the inside of the colony and being replaced by cooler bees that might be bearding. So I think there's some kind of relationship between that, and it should be interesting to take a look at it. So we know what heat shielding is actually doing. It's to just combating local heat stress. And we do a little bit of that, our own heat shielding when we use our cardiovascular system to sweat and things like that. And I mentioned earlier that bees are using their abdomen to press against areas of the colony that are too warm for brood baby to survive, because they want to make sure that they keep that brood nest in its exact minimal temperature ranges, so the brood cycles are normal. If you get hot brood, the bees will emerge early. They won't be they're developmentally stressed. So it behooves the Western honeybee inside of a cavity with homeostasis to keep those bees, everything in there at the optimal temperature for brood rearing. And so they use their abdomen. And I did some calculations with the aid of some artificial intelligence and fed those formulas, the mass of bees at about 125 milligrams, and I got back out of my my formulas that the bees can, a single bee, pressing its abdomen against a heated sidewall or on some brood that needs to be cooled, can take away about a calorie of heat from 3 bees. So we need a couple of hundred of bees to be engaged in this process, but I think it's something that we're discovering on the hot side of how bees act. All right, so is heat shielding real? I think it is. And this study made some headway in the acceptance of this is occurring in regular bee colonies like we keep. So the top row shows you a hive that was artificially heated, and its content, the constituents in there were normal. And as a precursor to this study, the scientists looked and discovered what age bees are actually engaged in heat shielding. That was a long process, but they managed to get some interesting data that shows that it's probably adult bees that are doing that, mostly adult bees, and other bees also. So what they did, if you're looking at the top line, is they started out with a preheated colony. You can see that over on the extreme left. Then they heated it, and you see that red dot in the middle, or that red square. That shows that they have applied heat at time 0, and then they timed it with infrared photography in 2-second intervals or something until it got all the way up to 15 minutes. And if you look across, you can see as that blob turns green or all green, it's cooled back to its normal temperature. And that took about 12 minutes with the full complement of adult bees doing this heat shielding behavior. On the bottom line, you're seeing bees that were heated also, but in this case, they removed the adult bees that they suspect were engaged in heat shielding. And you notice that without that heat shielding process or behavior in the colony below, it never really regained its full coolness even after 15 minutes. So it eventually did cool down, but it sort of like illustrates that heat shielding is a real thing and important to bees in hot weather. All right, so heat shielding has some consequences in any kind of colony, condensing colony or one that's doing some extreme ventilation. So bees can be subjected to oxidative stress, and you can see that if bees are taken away from their normal activities, you're going to get reduced nectar collection, probably some increase. Bees will dance and look for water to a greater extent than they'll go out for pollen and nectar. So that is the strongest drive they have. So if they're out engaged in heat shielding, they'll be not doing what they should be doing. All right, so so this is sort of like my final slide in this presentation, and I'll leave you with the fact that even though we discussed a lot of what occurs in the heating side of things, and I tried to emphasize or leave you with these thoughts that that's a natural process, and bees are engaged in their most biologically stable behaviors when they're in a condensing colony and there's homeostasis in the atmosphere there, or their internal environment. It's the same with high temps. So if you can reduce heat shielding, and that of course is primarily the effect of abundant, adequate insulation, and then of course the other things that follow is the adult bees can return more or less to their normal polyethicin. All right, so again, homeostasis is the key, and if you can recall anything about that little pyramid, that illustrates that thing. So here's 2 boxes. One is from a manufacturer down there in Australia, Hive IQ. I think he's got something in your vendor area. And go over here and talk to him, Victor, and he'll show you his box, and you can see how simple it is that you move your bees back to some semblance of a condensing colony. And you can see here these two colonies in high temperature. The one on the right is in full bearding, and it's ventilated. And then you can see the one on the left with, again, matched population in the exact same environment, how little they're bearding, and how I think it emphasizes the fact that if bees are allowed to stabilize their hive environment, even in hot temperatures, they're in better shape. All right, so that you'll see those. I saw these at the North American Honeybee Expo. There's a bunch of opportunities vendors are providing for you to buy automatic, regular, off-the-shelf condensing colonies that will function as condensing colonies. All right, that's about all I got, Andrew.